Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain and the Hand of Adonai series.
And I'm Alton Gansky up in Central California, the author most recently of The Village and about 45 other books. And I, as of today, have announced the release of the second book I wrote way back when, Through My Eyes. So it's out and available now.
Wonderful. I'm Molly Jo Riley. I am producer of the podcast, writer of the Unemployment Cookbook, and the upcoming mystery location novel, NOLA.
And I just realized I messed up my intro. I also wrote Firsts in Fiction, and so there we go. Now I got it in. It's just delayed. But a reminder to those of you listening to us on the audio-only podcast, if your schedule frees up on Tuesday nights at 6:30 p.m., we'd love to have you join us live in our Google Hangouts where we broadcast, and that way you can participate in the room, ask us some questions, correct us when we make mistakes, which is at least once every 3 or 4 years. Pretty momentous occasions if you're there. You can write that down. But do want to remind you of that. And also for those of you watching on YouTube, we really appreciate you watching. If you could hit the thumbs up button for us, that would really help us out, and don't be afraid to tell your friends that some good word of mouth never hurts either. So we do thank you for listening. Glad to have you along for the ride, and anything you can do to help out is greatly appreciated. We are a free podcast. Well, at least for now. You haven't gotten the bill yet. You'll be really surprised when that comes in, but we take payment plans, so all is well. But we are a free podcast, so if you like what you hear, sending it out to your friends is probably the best thanks that you could give us. So yeah, let's dive right in tonight. We've got a wild card week where we're going to talk about planning a series, but before we get to that, our Ask the Author segment comes from James Earls today. James Earls via Facebook contacted me, and he asks, do you write on Sundays? And so for me, I kind of took that as, do you have a day off? Do you take one day off weekly, a consistent day off, a Sabbath, if you want to use that term? And for me, the answer is fairly simple. I don't. I used to do it quite a bit. I used to put in 4 or 5 hours every Sunday, working on the podcast, doing show notes, uploading files, preparing the next week's podcast, doing some writing here and there. I've really tried to scale back on that for the sake of my sanity and also for the sake of my family. When I'm at home, I try and be a father and a husband more than I am just a slave to my computer and my obligations. So I will work longer days, Monday through Friday, and even on Saturdays, to try and protect my days at home with my family. So if I'm not doing anything else on Saturday, I might put in a couple hours in the morning while my kids are playing video games, but that's about the most I'll do. Now, of course, if I'm on a tight deadline, I sometimes have to write on Sunday, but I've usually been able to, so far, I've been lucky enough to be able to balance my schedule in such a way that I've not had to worry about that just yet. So we hope that will be true moving forward. How about you, Pops?
Well, I've had times when I've had to work 7 days a week and do that for a number of weeks straight. I can't say that I like it. I can't say that I recommend it to anyone. But that's usually been because of bad planning on my part or a lack of discipline. But occasionally, when you're a working writer, you take projects as they come. So we talked about Jeff Struecker quite a bit. The first book I did with him, I had to write in. It's a full-length novel. I had to write it in 6 weeks. So I was writing a lot every day, 7 days a week, until I was able to get that done. My practice, though, when possible, is not to work 7 days a week. Usually I do light stuff on Saturday, and then on Sunday I try to do nothing but, well, of course I go to church, but then there's NASCAR and napping to get done. So I try to take it off from work. And I find that, and most writers will tell you this, that if they take one day off from writing a week, they are better and will get more done the other days of the week. So I certainly try to do that unless circumstances change things and I suddenly have to make things up. So there, take that.
Okay, then. I try to write. I would like to say I try to write every day. To me, I'm not really specific to if it's a Sunday or a Wednesday. I do have a lot on my plates, and I have a lot of plates, so I try to write whenever I can. Sometimes that means just a handful of sticky notes throughout the day that I compile later and out as an outline or something. Generally, I do try to write, but as far as actually sitting down for an extended period, half an hour, 2 hours, or whatever, that usually only comes, honestly, to be honest, about once every other day on average. And a lot of times, yeah, that is on Sundays, but it is what you were saying, Al, pretty much almost every other day, or at least taking one full day to give the writing a break, but I'm always thinking about it. So
That's a good point. It's easy to take a day off from the computer where you're not actively writing, but seldom do I take a break from actually thinking about my projects. And so a lot of, I guess if it's work that I'm putting in, it's work that's not behind a computer. It's work that I'm daydreaming while I'm at church or picking up my kids from Sunday school or whatever the case may be, or while we're at lunch or some such. But yeah, I am still working on that, and I think it's important to do that, to still remain immersed, at least in your imagination, in your project. I would say 7 days a week. Do a little bit of thinking about it. You don't have to fixate on it. You don't have to ignore your family on it. You don't have to lock your door to your room and hide under the covers until you break whatever writer's block you're facing. But sometimes writer's block is best broken, fixed, whatever, conquered when you are not at the computer. I think sometimes the computer can be a detriment to getting past writer's block, which will be a subject for our an Ask the Author here coming up pretty soon. But we'll wait until then for that one. So, Pops, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was usually when I do my planning, I will figure out how many pages I have to do and how many I have to do per work day. So it's usually 20 days a month, 21. It's really like 21 and a half day work days, but I usually use 20 because there's something's going to happen and I'm going to lose a day. And I don't factor in the weekends for that. Sometimes I'll use a Saturday to catch up, but I do that. And if you don't take some time off from the work, you'll come to hate the work. And if you begin to hate your project, then you're not going to do a very good job with it. So it's good to take some time off.
Agreed. Just not too much. Too much time off is going to make it real tough to get back into the project. So if you find yourself 3 days out of your project, find a way to get back in, even if it's just for 10 or 15 minutes, even if it's just for 10 to 15 words. Get yourself back in. That's Stephen King's advice, but I think it's pretty solid and pretty sound. I think Stephen King says On Writing, he says that the amount of time you take out of a project is going to be the amount of time it's going to take you to get back into it. So if you take a week off, you're going to have a week of struggling to get back into your work and having actual productive pages come around. I'm relatively sure he's said that On Writing. Otherwise, I just completely fabricated that right now. But it's still a good idea. It's a good reference, good rule of thumb there. So there you go. Very long answers to a very short question. Thank you, James Earls, for sending that in. And for those of you who have your own burning questions, you can reach us via Twitter or Facebook or firstinfictionpodcast@gmail.com. However you can get in touch with us, leave us a note, and we'll put that on the list of questions to answer as we move through. But for now, we turn our attention to our main topic. It is a wild card week. It's the 5th Tuesday in the month, and so we're leaving conflict behind right now and answering a question that was suggested by a listener. Was it last week in the room that they asked this question? So that's another place to get your Ask the Author question in. And it was such a good question, I thought we'd take an entire week to cover it, an entire podcast to cover it, because it's going to take that much time. And the question was simple. how do you plan and execute a series of novels? And so I think in order to adequately answer that, we have to understand that there are different types of series. The easiest one that comes to mind is your basic trilogy in a fantasy or science fiction series, something like that. But not all of them take that particular shape. These traditional series usually feature a consistent storyline. So the conflict, the central conflict that's set up in the first book, is the same central conflict that runs through the entire series, be that 3 books, be that 4 books. What would you call, by the way, Pops, totally off the cuff here, what do you call a series of 4 books? I know trilogy is 3. What would the next one be? A quadrilogy?
Trilogy plus 1.
Oh, okay. All right. Write that down.
Is that official? Is that official publication speakage, or?
It might be quadruped.
Molly, if I say it, it's probably nowhere near official.
Well, you just burst that bubble.
It's a quadruped unless I write it, in which case it's a quadriplegic. Too far. All right, enough of that. So anyhow, so this is a central conflict that's carried over from book to book, and you're going to have some reoccurring characters in here. They are going to go through their own character arcs, which we'll talk about later. Some might live, some might die, but then there are some more. No, nobody dies.
You're going to make us fall in love with characters in the first book. You should not kill them off.
Okay, point well taken. I need to go change some of my books.
Yes, you do. Spoiler alert.
There are some exceptions to this rule, some more non-traditional types of series, kind of a reoccurring characters. But Pops, you mentioned a really good example here from Jack Kavanaugh, the series that he's put together, which kind of defies all the rules here. I put that in quotation marks, that we're trying to establish for what a series is and how it's written. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You mentioned that often you have the same characters in the subsequent books, and that is certainly not unusual. Sue Grafton with Kinsey Milhone, the mystery. We've mentioned Clive Cussler many times, Dirk Pitt, and then he's got another series of characters too. And they carry through. So the plots are different in each of the books, but the characters remain the same, and that's what makes it a series. But there is a type of series which you've mentioned, and that is where a theme carries through. So usually in fantasy you'll see this. It's sort of an epic tale that is told over several books. But another form is what Jack Kavanaugh did with a series of books, and these are his first books, by the way. It's a series of 9 books called The American Family Portrait. Excellent, excellent series. And in the show notes, I'll have a link to his site so you can see all of these. In his case, he didn't use the same characters. He used the same family, but it's spread out from Puritan times in England to contemporary times. So you're not going to have the same characters all the way through 200-300 years with that. But he has a MacGuffin, an object that starts in the first book and is carried through the whole series. And so rather than a character, it's an object. MacGuffin is a catalyst. The term comes from Alfred Hitchcock, and it's a thing that drives the story forward without being the story itself. So the classic example is the Maltese Falcon, which is a statue of a bird, but the story is not really about the bird. It's just the thing that brings all the people together and creates the conflict. But his MacGuffin is a Bible that came into the family during the Puritan times in England, and then it's by tradition passed to the oldest son of the next generation. And somehow or another, that Bible's going to play some role in the story, but you get a different generation of Morgans, that's the family name, Morgans, as you read through the books. So you got the first Morgan, and then you work your way through these, and so the characters aren't the same. The family name's the same, and the thing that ties them all together is this particular Bible. So sometimes you can do a series not just on characters, but on a particular event that reoccurs, a particular object that reoccurs, that sort of thing. And he ran that for award-winning series. He ran that for 9 books.
Wow. I have a question on that.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure if this would count. I say I'm working on a city series. NOLA is the first of. I have ideas to write mysteries set in cities where the city itself is so dynamic and that the story cannot be told anywhere else.
Sure.
So I have a certain story that I'm telling in New Orleans. Then my next book is going to be set in Central Park, New York City. But the characters are not the same. The location is not the same. Is that still part of a series? Because the theme is, I call it a city series because the theme is where obviously the location is going to be so dynamic. It's going to be as if it were its own character.
In that case, I would say no. First of all, it's just a great idea because it's a great hook to have these different cities because there's so many great cities. You're talking. I'm thinking of San Francisco and Denver and Chicago and some of the others. You could go on forever.
I've got about 10 of them planned, so I'll be writing for a while.
What you have there is a motif. You have your genre, and the genre is mysteries. Then you have the motif that ties them together. There's always a city involved, someplace. We'll go back to Clive Cussler. There's always some ancient historical object or event or something that will, towards the end of the book, play into the end of the book, the solution to the book. So he sets it up in the prologue, and you forget about it through at least the first 2 acts, and then it raises its head again and is useful for that. So he has this motif, this pattern of doing things, and I would think that that's what you have. You agree with me on that, Aaron?
Well, did you say that Dean Koontz was doing that?
No, I didn't say Dean Koontz.
I thought I heard Dean Koontz. Clive Cussler is the one who does that, yes?
That's what I said. Clive Cussler does it, yeah.
Did I just hear that wrong? Is it that late? Okay.
You heard that wrong.
It's not unusual in a man your age.
Okay, well, we thank you all for joining us, and until next week, it's about time for me to set up.
But Dean Koontz is a good example.
Answer the question.
Dean Koontz is a good example because he does have a series, and for the longest time he didn't write in series. I think he did 2 books that had shared the same character, and then he stumbled onto something that came to him. You know which one I'm talking about, Aaron?
Odd Thomas.
Odd Thomas, and that became a series, which was kind of new for him, if memory serves. But there he has Odd Thomas in all the books, so it's a character series.
And I don't think that he intended that to be a series, but it turned into one. I think series a lot of times come from people, the author's heart, when they become so invested in their characters and they want to see them again. That's the other type of series. But before I jump into that, I'll answer your question as to whether or not I agree with your take on Molly's quasi-series. And yeah, I would agree with that. There's a similar motif running through them, but because there are no recurring characters or objects, or perhaps, I don't know, if you found a particular theme that ran through them, you might be able to kind of sell it as kind of a series, but they might actually be grouped as a series. I'm trying to think, like in Barnes & Noble, would the publisher tout these as the location series or the 7 city series or something like that? I think for them to do that, they'd want a more tangible connection between the books, other than just similar motifs and setups.
I do have, there will be a connection, but it's a surprise for right now, so.
Well, why don't you go ahead and announce it on air so that we can all take notes. And
okay, it's up. And so I hope you all enjoy it.
Excellent. I can't wait to see that. The other type of series is the recurring characters series, and this is where you see the same character or characters throughout a novel, but the central conflict is different from point to point. So the first one, we have a central conflict that runs throughout the span of the books. Think of something like Star Wars, right? The original trilogy, 4, 5, and 6. We've got the destruction of the Empire and the rebuilding of the Jedi Order, etc. But then you look at something like James Bond, for example, where you've got the same character, but each movie, each book, it's got its own plot points, its own story arc that is not necessarily connected to the earlier works. You might see some callbacks here and there, but for the most part, when you watch a James Bond film, the problem at the beginning is solved by the end. As opposed to something like The Lord of the Rings, where you've got this magical ring that must be destroyed, and at the end of Act 1, or rather, I'm sorry, at the end of the first movie, ring has not been destroyed just yet. Things have gotten worse, and the end of
thanks for spoiling that for me.
Sorry, I'm going to ruin the second one too. They don't destroy it in the second one either, and so the central conflict there is the destruction of the ring. In Star Wars, it's the destruction of the Empire. These are things that you see elements of in all three of the series, all three episodes of the series, if you will, as opposed to something like a James Bond. Or Pops, you've mentioned a couple more here. We talked about Dean Koontz, but you also mentioned Sue Grafton. And I'm familiar with Sue Grafton. I've never actually read them, though. So why don't you talk to our listeners about that?
Yeah, she has a great series of books, all done in first person. Her character is Kinsey Milhone, who's a no-nonsense female private detective. And the books really are a lot of fun, and they're well constructed. So she has the same character going from book to book to book. Each book is standalone. You don't need the previous ones. If you are a reader who reads all of them in order, then there will be things introduced, say, in book 5 that may have occurred in book 3, and as a reader of all of them, you'll pick up on that, but it's not necessary to really understand that for you to appreciate that book number 5. So Sue Grafton's very good. Again, we mentioned Clive Cussler. Really, you can think a bunch of people who write in series. I was thinking, when you were talking there, Molly, of Agatha Christie. I went away for a little while there, but I'm back now. Need more coffee. Agatha Christie, who's the best-selling author ever. She has over 1 billion books sold.
Yeah, I want to be like her.
Yeah, she's the only books that outsell her are the Bible and Shakespeare. So
that's an amazing record.
Yeah, huge success. But she had a whole series of series. My favorite being Tommy and Tuppence, Partners in Crime, and it's a husband and wife in the 1920s, and they end up becoming private detectives, and they're just so quirky. They're fabulous. And so you get used to them, and you meet them in the first book. Well, you want to read the second book because these guys are unforgettable. And so that's what drives you to the next book, is the fact that these characters are so strong. So many of her books, Hercule Poirot, and many of the others are that way. I think Sherlock Holmes, same characters from book to book, but every challenge is different. So recurring characters is probably the most frequently used technique for writing in series.
Absolutely. And one of the advantages to that is that you're not necessarily limited to 3 or 4 books, or if you're Robert Jordan, 13 books, to tell one central conflict, to tell one particular tale. You can, Sue Grafton, I guess, has somewhat limited herself to 26 books in her series, though I guess she could always say AA is for Aaron, if she really wanted to, but I'm sure she doesn't. So that's one of the advantages to the recurring characters and having those standalone books featuring the same characters is there's really no limit to how long those can go. James Bond is being made even regardless of who plays them on the film. Some books are written, some characters are picked up by other authors. Robert Jordan's series, Wheel of Time series, he passed away before he even finished that, and another author picked up the mantle and finished it. And so the characters can and often do outlive their creators and can live on, like Sherlock Holmes, for the better part of a century.
Nero Wolfe did that. Rex Stout, after he died, the publishers brought in a different writer, and they brought back Nero Wolfe. Again, same characters, whole bunch of books, but different subject each time. So yeah, that's not unusual. Like you say, they did it with James Bond. They've done it with, I think, Perry Mason, which again is a mystery. So mysteries really are great for series.
Absolutely. But how then, the question is, how do these work in the world of publishing? So Pops, you've got a lot more insight here. You've done a couple of series. How does publishing work with this?
Yeah, it's always a little dicey in publishing because no one ever knows what's going on. I've told you and told our audience this before, but when you go to down a New York street and you see these publishing houses, you think you're looking at a business, but really what you're seeing is a casino. It's all gambling because no one really knows what's going to make it, what's not going to make it. So as you mentioned, Sue Grafton started with A is out for alibi. I think B was for burglary or something like that. But she had no idea that it was going to go. She's up to X now, go that long, but she was prepared for it. So if it did take off, great. If it didn't take off, there wouldn't be that many people disappointed because the books weren't selling. So, but when you think of series, they're notorious for sales that fall off. So we see these series and we think that's the way to go. I'm going to write 10 topics, 10 books on this particular group of characters with that, but there's a good chance you won't see book 3. In fact, in one case in my series, I had a contract for 3 books in a series, and time I got done with book 2 and was looking at the sales, I wrote a little note to the publisher and said, look, these things are falling off. Why do we want to write a book that's going to sell less than book 2, which is selling less than book 1? It's just not making sense. Let's put out something new, and that became 0G. I had another idea for them. They said, yeah, let's do that. So it's not unusual to see that. So it seems to me it's almost that they will take off or they will die very quickly.
You're not encouraging me.
One works, one doesn't. I don't know. What's that?
Oh.
You're not encouraging me here.
No, your series is going to take off really great, Aaron. Okay. Really great.
All right, thank you.
Well, I'm talking about lesser authors.
Oh. Well, I thought you were just talking about yourself.
Mere mortals. Well, that's what I'm telling you.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, so readers like a series because they know the characters already, so they're invested. But they don't always take off. But then again, they can. So you see Odd Thomas, which was Dean Koontz, I think, initially thought it was going to be a flash in the pan. The idea came to him. They've done quite well for him. So we don't know. I did some with a character named Madison Glenn, and I never got to complete the series. I mentioned earlier that my book, Through My Eyes, is out. That was meant to be a 3-book series. By My Hands, Through My Eyes, and With My Voice. With My Voice was never written because the numbers began to fall off, and I was writing for another publisher at the same time, so I began to focus on that.
Well,
so
now
you have to keep that in mind.
Hooked us, so now you have to finish it. You have to write it.
And that speaks to the power of the series because I get things like that. In fact, I got a comment today that somebody just read the Madison Glenn series and they want more books. And I started to write back. I think it came over Facebook or something and say, if you'll guarantee me that you'll buy 3,000 copies, I'll write one. Because it's a lot of work to put in because somebody wants one.
Well, I think you could count on maybe at least 5 copies between us in the room.
Yeah, that's what I want to do. I'm going to lay down 100,000 words for 5 copies.
It could happen.
It's the process, Pops. The process is its own reward. Whatever money you make after that is just icing on the cake. So.
Yeah, also be just prepared that publishing changes. So when I was working and writing the Strucker books, there were supposed to be 5 in that series. The first 3 went great, and they wrote a contract for some more, a couple more. We never did 5. I got 100 pages in it, and the publisher killed it, just because things changed at the publishing house. So I've got 35,000 words or so on that particular book 5. I'm just sitting around. So it doesn't mean, and I'm not trying to be dire about this, it doesn't mean it's going to fail, but this is writing, this is creative, and sometimes things work out, sometimes things don't. And so you have to kind of be prepared for that.
Well, our question tonight was how do you plan one? And so we've talked a lot about what they are, but the way you go about planning them, I think, can vary widely depending on the type of series. Obviously, if you are doing the recurring character standalone type series where each episode, kind of episodic, if you will, each book you would plan individually. If you are planning a larger series with that consistent conflict, I think the planning of that takes a different shape. And so, Pops, the J.D. Stanton books that you wrote and the Strucker books are not necessarily, they don't follow one central conflict. Those are all kind of standalone books with recurring characters, yes?
Right. I wanted to take ordinary people and put them in extraordinary circumstances. That was sort of my mantra in writing these. And with J.D. Stanton, the book was first book was A Ship Possessed, and there was Vanished and Out of Time. I didn't have all of those. In fact, I didn't know I was going to write A Ship Possessed. I don't know if I've told the story here how I ended up getting that. Have I told that on this podcast? Okay, well,
yeah.
We're assuming there's some new people here. Basically, it went like this. I always proposed the book I wanted to sell, but I always included a page of a half dozen other possible story ideas. My thinking is always give them a reason to say yes. Sure enough, a major publisher read the last line on that secondary page, and the only reason that last line was on there is I thought there was too much white space on the page. And I came up with this concept for what would become A Ship Possessed. I put it in there, got a phone call and said, hey, we really can't use the book that you're suggesting here, but this one here, A Ship Possessed, is that still available? Or has somebody picked that up? No, I think it's still available. Yeah, well, can you send me more on it? Sure. Well, I had no idea what it was. I spent 3 nights staring at the ceiling trying to figure out what the book was about. So I kind of fell into that one. And that went into to series there. So with each one, I have one primary character, J.D. Stanton, who repeats. And then there's this motif that we're talking about earlier. It always has some supernatural suspense to it, one way or the other. Some oddball thing, something that's out of the norm, can't be explained easily or if at all, and then I would write the book. So they're each a little different in that Ship Possessed is about a World War II submarine that returns to the United States 50 years late without its crew and in the wrong ocean, but it did not come back alone. So that's A Ship Possessed. Vanished is about a small town, which was a military town called Roanoke. You'll see the connection here. That suddenly goes missing. Everyone in it is gone in one night. And then Out of Time is about a World War II dreadnought, which would have been back World War I, that sails out of the fog into the contemporary time, and J.D. Stanton's on a catamaran with a bunch of teenagers, troubled teenagers, and they have to investigate it. So, and that was it. That's what tied it all together, was J.D. Stanton and the weirdness.
That is very weird.
What about the Strucker books?
Yeah, now Strucker is a little different thing because technically I'm the co-author, though I did all the writing. But Major Strucker, I guess I should call him Reverend Strucker now. But anyway, he had been in special ops and that sort of thing, Army Ranger. And he wanted to do a book about a team of mixed individuals. And so they came to me and they said, this is the basic idea we have. He gave me the team. He gave me the basic plot point in it called, in the military they have a thing called certain jeopardy. That's where you're on a mission and you see something far more important than what you're having to do. And so you, on your own, as a mission leader, change the mission. And that's called a certain jeopardy situation. Well, he did that. And that was the basis of the first book called Certain Jeopardy, because he was fairly well known because of the Black Hawk Down affair. They signed him, I think, for 3 or 4 books out the gate. And so we just had to keep coming up with new ones, and the team would change some. You know, not all of them make it. The team would change some, the dynamic would change. They would go to a different place in the world, face a different type of crisis. But it's always this team that has to go in.
Good, so you've got the recurring characters there, but the standalone things. So
yeah, same motif. That this team is going to save the day somehow, some way, at great cost to themselves. But it's going to be this team. So it's recurring characters again.
Okay. And so for me, my series was planned in a very different way. When I actually started Hand of Adonai, I was mildly interested in fantasy, but I thought I was so much better than it, and I didn't like a lot of the fantasy tropes, and I was going to set out to prove everybody wrong, and I was going to write a great fantasy that didn't portray all the fantasy tropes, and quickly learned how foolish that was. But one of the things that I didn't like was that every fantasy book, you couldn't have a standalone fantasy book. It always had to be a series of 3 books, 4 books, 7 books, 15 books, whatever. So I thought, I'm going to write a great standalone fantasy novel. And so I did, and I'm a discovery writer, so I didn't do a ton of planning. I had an idea, and I went with it. I did borrow very heavily from a lot of fantasy motifs and tropes, and try to kind of poke fun at them. Try to be a little self-aware with those types of jokes and irony. But at some point, it felt like the book became less of a spoof of the genre, and I actually started falling in love with the genre. And instead of wanting to spoof it, I wanted to pay kind of homage to it, if you will. And I got to the end of the book and realized this is too long for a standalone, but it's too short for a series. And I think it was my agent who actually suggested to me, you got to pick one or the other. You got to really trim this back, or you've got to expand it. And so I thought, well, I'm going to expand it. And I had naturally or instinctively broken it into 3 different books. It started book 1, and then it was kind of act 1, book 2, book 3, and those were the 3 different acts. And so I thought, well, I've already got it broken up into acts, and so all I'm going to do is take the actual book 1. It's a little bit short for a standalone, so I'm going to make it a little bit longer. I'm going to take the central conflict in book 2, expand on that. Same thing with book 3, and on and on. Well, by the time I got halfway through book 2, this was a completely different thing, and the ending that I'd written in the first book was not going to work anymore. And so I had to do a lot of discovery writing, specifically in book 2. Book 1 came fairly easily. But as I wrote book 2, I went back and changed things on book 1. And then I started writing book 3, and I had to go back and change things in book 1 and book 2. And so the discovery writing became very difficult for me. I did it kind of seat of my pants. And there are times, I'm not an outliner, and I still am glad that I haven't outlined it, but there are times where I look back and I think, man, if I had outlined this, it would be a lot more streamlined and a lot easier to know where I was going, and probably would be a lot faster. Probably not be as much fun for me to write, but it would definitely have been a lot faster. And so for me, a lot of it came out through the discovery writing process, and a lot of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, not just one book, but 2 books, 3 books at a time. And so as I approach the final book in the series, I'm starting to outline, doing a very rough outline, figuring out how I'm going to tie it up in one more book and make sure that book isn't 8,000 pages. So I'm trying to streamline that there and figure that out. So the outlining has come a lot later. Not necessarily the way that I would suggest going about starting your series. If I could go back in time, I would probably do a little bit more planning, and I would come up with the central conflict, and I would really flesh that out, and I would put all the plot points in along the way, and I would really determine where the natural breaks were coming. I would probably look for a 3-act structure, I think is the easiest thing to do, and then that way it fits into a trilogy, because Act 1 should be its own story arc. It should have its own rising action, conflict, crisis resolution. It should have all that, but that should not resolve the central conflict. If we think of Lord of the Rings, the central conflict, the first one is the Fellowship of the Ring, and so it's about forming the Fellowship and the Fellowship sticking together, and so eventually at the end, the result is that the Fellowship breaks up. And then the second one has its own kind of a thing, and the third one is where ultimately the last piece of the puzzle is put together and everything is tied together. Star Wars is another good example of this, where you look at Episode 4, and that's a standalone movie. He made that as a standalone. You know why, Pops, he made that as a standalone?
Why is that?
Because he didn't know if it was going to sell. Neither did the producers. So he created this. He said, it'll be fun. This is the most complete story that I have of all these. I think at that point he had 9, 1 through 9 planned out. And he didn't know if it was going to sell, so he made 4 because it seemed like the best, most complete story. And it is. You've got the Death Star, and you've got Luke Skywalker becoming a Jedi, or at least beginning his training, and he uses the Force and blows up the Death Star. Spoiler alert, sorry. There you go. It's a standalone. It's got its own story, its own 3-act structure. But then comes Episode 5, and at this point he knew that Star Wars was selling. So when you get to the end of that one, it's very much a unresolved ending. It's a cliffhanger, if you will. Darth Vader's still out there. He's not dead. They're still building the Death Star. We didn't get rid of that second Death Star. And so it's each of these, though, as they have their own story arcs, their own rising action, conflict, crisis resolution, but they also are establishing a piece of the larger world. In Episode 4, you've got the introduction of what the Force is and who the Jedi were. In Episode 5, he begins his Jedi training, and that's kind of building up. And then in the last one, you could say he completes his Jedi training, and now he can look on to maybe training future generations of Jedi. And so the main conflict, which is the Emperor and the Empire and the injustice in the universe or the galaxy, is not really resolved until Episode 6. And so you might want to look at a 3-act structure here. But you also want to make sure that each of your entries, each of your episodes, has its own 3-act structure, almost a kind of a 9-act structure there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the story itself has to have a beginning, middle, and end. And a long series needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's often why things are done in trilogies, because you can do that at a larger scale. But you got to make sure that the book you're working on, that particular volume, that episode, has a beginning, middle, and end, a first, a second, and a third act, and something to bolster the middle act, which is the longest one, the second act. Yeah, so you can have a larger storyline and tell smaller stories in it, which is really a great way to go. And you see some of that in Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes' personal troubles, his cocaine addiction, and other things, his fear of women and the like. That gets kind of doled out through the many different short stories and books.
Yeah. So that's where I would start, is with that story arc. Kurt Vonnegut Jr. talks about his process of planning Slaughterhouse-Five, which is just a standalone novel, but it took him months and even years to plan that out and figure out how he wanted to tell that story. And so I think it's well worth our time to figure out how we're going to present the events in our story. And it doesn't even have to be chronological. I mean, you could do 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3 if you're really eccentric. I don't know if that would ever work, though. But, man, it sure makes 7 a lot better, doesn't it? Anyhow. So you can even tell stories out of order. You can do prequels and sequels, and it supports that. That's the great thing about series, is it supports that. The other thing that you'll want to do, and this is a big deal, is you want to plan your story world. Where does this world take place? So if we look at something even like Odd Thomas, which is not a trilogy in and of itself, it doesn't have a larger story arc going from book to book. Each book is kind of self-contained. The story world persists, and that's contemporary America. However, there's weirdness, and there's a weirdness that normal people can't see, but that Odd Thomas can. And so in planning this weirdness and all the different ghouls and goblins and things of that nature, you have to have some consistency. You have to have some consistency. If you've got a magic system, if you listen to Writing Excuses, they talk about this all the time. If you've got a magic system, you're writing a fantasy book, magic needs to work in a particular way. There needs to be some rules governing it so that the the reader knows how, what rules you're establishing for your world. What plants and animals you put in there if you're designing your own setting for a sci-fi and you've got a planet out there. Give the plants and animals unique names and remember them and bring them back from book to book to book and make them important. So there are lots of things that you want to think of. If you do it well, there's no end to the amount of writing that can be done within your setting. Point in case would be Star Wars. How many novels have been written that are not considered canon, right? But I mean, any Star Wars fan can pick up a pen and paper and write something that takes place in the Star Wars galaxy. There's going to be lightsabers. There's going to be bounty hunters. There's going to be, good versus evil. All those types of things. These are the tropes that are so well defined within the series that anybody could pick them up and start using them. Lord of the Rings. Several authors have written about Middle Earth. Video games have been created that take place in Middle Earth based on the writings of Tolkien and other writers. And so if you are good with that and you've got consistency in your detail, that's going to make your series even more rich. Some of the things you'll want to think of, and for the sake of time, I'll go kind of quickly, but you want to think of things like the flora and the fauna, birds and trees and animals. You want to think of science. Does science work the way our science works? In Odd Thomas, it doesn't always. He's got basic science, but then he's got supernatural science. In Lord of the Rings, there's some magic that goes on there. Brandon Sanderson wrote a great series called the Mistborn series, and in it, people are able to ingest metals and use those to have types of superpowers. And the science behind it, he comes up with a science for it, biological and metallurgical science that explains this phenomenon. The economy, how does this work? If I'm giving gold pieces to somebody for an iron sword, I've just said that iron is more expensive than gold. It's worth more than gold. And so how does the economy work? Politics, and this was one of the things that I shied away from originally in the Hand of Adonai series, was because I thought politics was boring. Turns out there's a reason that fantasy writers include politics in their writing. It's because it's important, and it's your world has a political structure, and our world, the world that we live in, has a political structure. And so is it the same? Is it different? How so? The history, having a good backstory for your setting, for your characters, for all of the events that are going to transpire. Just knowing all of that is going to be important for you to know moving forward, so that your world is rich and feels real and deep, and the characters, or rather the readers, can then experience what the characters are experiencing. And so I feel like I've talked a lot. Pops, you want to handle characters?
Sure. I'm just thinking about some of the characters. In doing series, consistency is the hard part. So usually in the first book, you'll get some background on it. You don't have to reveal everything in the first book. If you know there's going to be at least one other book, you can reveal more personal details a little later. Same thing with the third book. So I wouldn't lay everything out right up front. I would let some of that just develop if you think there's going to be a second and a third or more books. And if you don't plan that far ahead, then you're going to have to create that as you go along. If you're doing character-based series, of course, you're going to have your list of your protagonist who's going to go from book to book to book, but you may have different antagonists along the way. If you're introducing new characters, at what point do they come in? And this is why doing series can be very difficult, especially for new writers, is you don't know how many books you're going to be able to sell. And in a market that's struggling right now, publishing is struggling, they're not offering as large advances anymore, unless you're a huge bestseller or something. So the advance money is a little less, and marketing's not what it used to be, those sorts of things. So you may plan out a 10-book series and never get that far. So you have to make the first books just absolutely wonderful. Keep some of your ideas for later, along with your characters, and they should always face another. If it's a huge theme that's spread out over several books, and you're going to have the same antagonist behind the scenes, but each of those stories also needs to stand alone and on its own feet, I think. Is that what you were thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, you think of the Lord of the Rings series, and you've got Sauron. He's the main antagonist that's big and bad and overshadows everything. It's good to have a centralized antagonist, but it's not necessary. Again, the Dean Koontz series, the Clive Cussler series, those types of things, you don't have the same antagonist in every film. Even Star Wars, you've got the same one in 4, 5, and 6, but you've got a different one in 1, 2, and 3. Well, I guess technically you could argue it's the same one in 1, 2, and 3, but 7 presents a new antagonist that's largely tied to the previous antagonist. It's more the dark side is kind of the antagonist. So even though it's this ethereal force, it's still the driving force and becomes a character of its own. So you want to plan which characters are going to be in there. If you've got a large cast of characters, it's really easy to forget people. You're writing a scene in book 1 where you've got 4 characters, and then in book 2 you're writing about that same group and there's only 3 because you forgot the 4th one was there. That's problematic. So you need to keep track of that kind of stuff. If there's a reason why you only want 3 in book 2, then you got to find a way to get rid of the 4th guy in book 1. And so tracking that in the Wheel of Time series, there are, I don't know how many characters. I stopped counting at like 57. I'm not really exaggerating. You need a program. you need a play-by-play or something, a glossary. But there are several characters who just don't even appear in certain books. Each of these books is 1,000+ pages, and you're going to go 1,000+ pages and never mention my favorite character. That's problematic for me. But there might be a reason for it, and so knowing which characters are going to get how many pages, because the more characters you add, the more pages you're adding, and so each point of view that you add is going to add more pages as well. Which characters are worthy of a point of view? The book I'm currently working on started off as first person, and I've since gone back and made it multiple first-person perspectives because several of the characters really demanded their own perspective be told. And there are some that I'm just falling in love with being able to write from their perspective, and I'm just in love with the way that they see the world. And it's deepening the relationships between the characters. And so one thing that you can do is write from other characters' perspectives and see how that changes the story, see if it gives it a different flavor, a different feel, a different taste. That can, for lack of a better term, cleanse the palate. If you're thinking of a complex meal, you want some sweet, you want some savory, you want a little salt, those types of things. Balancing things out like the textures and the flavors in a book is really, really important, and the characters are probably going to provide the most diversity of flavor for your book, because the setting is going to be great, but that's going to be a pretty consistent tone and note throughout, whereas the characters are going to be able to provide that vibrancy that you're looking for, that complexity that you're looking for. And so one thing you might want to do is create a list of your characters, which ones are getting their own points of view, and what does their point of view add to the story that the other characters' points of view aren't adding. And if the answer is nothing, then maybe they don't get their own point of view, right? Another thing that you can do is to plan your timeline and your paths. With the Hand of Adonai series, at the risk of spoiling things, well, yeah, okay, I've already said too much. Anyhow, the group doesn't stick together. They take different paths. They have to take different paths. And so it's kind of like Lord of the Rings, right? This group goes over here, this group goes over there. And so you're going to have different people in different places and at different times. And so you want to keep that consistent, keeping a timeline, knowing where your characters are and when your characters are, if you're doing some sort of time travel or something, is going to be very, very important. So you don't write one scene with the sun setting and then the next scene is the sun rising, but it's supposed to be at the same time. That's going to be confusing. So keeping a track of the timeline, where your characters are within your story world, that's going to become very important as well. So those are all things to think of. You don't have to have all the answers before you begin writing, but as you go, it's going to be increasingly important to keep track of all those things. So there's that. Pops, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think we pretty much covered it.
Whew. There's all you need to know about planning a series. We'll see you next week. No, I'm just kidding. Molly, Joe, comments from the room, questions, concerns?
Let's start back down at the bottom. There was an active room today. We had Tess and Becky, both Tess DeGroot and Becky Lindsay, and I love it because they tend to listen while they are cooking or eating dinner, so we get a lot of food references, and they were enjoying spaghetti and meatballs and chicken breast with asparagus and cheese, and I know it doesn't matter to you guys, but I'm a foodie, so that just makes it all the more better for me. Tess was not a fan of NASCAR, so we're not going to discuss that. And Becky and I are in cahoots as to, I'm sorry, in a discussion as to which is the better driver. So Becky wants to know, Al, who is your favorite driver when you mentioned NASCAR?
That's kind of hard. Carl Edwards. Yeah.
Carl is good.
Carl
I like
Edwards,
Jimmy Johnson.
in
She
NASCAR.
likes Junior.
Yeah, everybody likes Junior. Then in Indy, I've got about 4 in the IndyCar races, so that I like to follow.
Very good. We talked about taking a break from the computer once a week is important, but even with that, both Becky and Tess said that even taking a break once a week from the computer, they still write notes down on paper and keep it going that way. Back to the NASCAR. Tess is always a fan of Dirk Pitt, so every time you mention him, she swoons. We reference different series that we like. What was that, Aaron?
I was going to say, did you just say jerk pit?
I did, and I'm sorry, but my mouth just is not working well tonight.
Is that Freudian? Is that Freudian there?
My mouth is not working well tonight. We're just going to leave it alone. Mary Ruth checked in. Mary Ruth Hughes. She's a friend of mine, and I'm helping to edit her manuscript, and I'm very excited because she always likes the podcast. She's quiet. She watches it, doesn't comment a lot, but she did comment that she finished up her last chapter tonight, which is great. That means I get to go have dinner with her tomorrow and go over it, so that's exciting. Tess enjoyed reading The Hand of Adonai.
Yay.
And yeah, she also said she's found that if you violate your own rules for your world in sci-fi or fantasy story, the readers will come after you. They take the world you have created very seriously and trust you not to suddenly shift left when they thought you'd go right.
You know what that reminds?
Just go to a Star Trek convention.
I was just thinking that. I love Galaxy Quest, that old Star Trek spoof movie, Galaxy Quest, which is just hilarious. Where
that's a great movie.
They start complaining about the timing of the engine and what cylinders are firing when, and it was just so ridiculous. It's funny. Point well made, Tess. Thank you.
And that's it. Becky says that she really enjoyed the podcast. Lots of info to consider. Thanks.
Oh, our pleasure.
I want to say that for myself, thank you, because I wasn't as participatory in the show notes and the answers and questions during the podcast, but I did learn a lot with whether or not I'm writing a series or just a number of books with the same motif. So that was informative for me too. Thank you.
All right. Very cool. And next week, we are going to turn our attention to the business, which means, Pops, you're going to be doing a lot of talking because you've got more experience there than I do for sure. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at agents next week. What you need to know about agents, how to find a good one, what role they play, all those wonderful types of things. So we do encourage you to ask the author, again, via Twitter or Facebook or email. However you want to do that in the various avenues, we'll make sure that we get those questions put on the list to answer. And if you are looking for us throughout the week, you can find Pops at altongansky.com. You can find Molly Jo at franklymydearmojo.com. You can find me at aarongansky.com. So we thank you all for
over
listening.
at my site, you can find out about Through My Eyes. I just put information up there about the 2 books, By My Hands and Through My Eyes, and you can take a look at that. And then also today I had a blog post come out on novelrocket.com. One word, novelrocket.com. There'll be a new one as of late tonight, but you can still see that one. And it has to do with whether or not you have a story or if the story has you.
Oh, intriguing.
Ooh, I'm going to have to check that out. I will say publicly on air that Through My Eyes was one of my favorite Gansky novels. So if you get a chance, if you haven't read By My Hands, pick that one up first and then read Through My Eyes. I remember reading that long ago when you first published it. Really impressed with it, Pop. So you did a good job. That's one of my top 5, I think, that you've written. So it's good stuff. Make sure you guys pick that up, tell your friends, rate it, give it a good rating on Amazon, and all that kind of stuff. So
give all of our books good ratings.
And while you're at it, why don't you click the thumbs up on YouTube? Yes, give us all good ratings, please and thank you. And also thumbs up on YouTube. And we thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.